Thank you so much to Dominic and Andrea and everyone for having me here. This paper began as a talk about cinema, and it evolved into a talk about media in general, but it never quite got to where it was evolving to, so there's a sort of slippage that occurs throughout it. Part 1, Archive, Cloud, Common. Consider the following 6 trajectories. More and more people are being born today, and more of them live out a full life. Close to 1 in 10 who have ever lived are alive today. With birth rates exceeding death rates, that percentage is increasing. More and more of these people are growing up with recording technologies, tools that preserve something of the present for the future. Audiovisual social media like YouTube, Pinterest, Flickr, and their many siblings provide an ever-expanding archive of material uploaded, downloaded, re-edited, cross-referenced, spoofed, and endlessly commented upon. While some of the image data added to this archive is added by individuals for their personal or collective consumption and narrative construction, other less public databases are built and maintained by state or private institutions to monitor, survey, manage, predict, market, and prognosticate. Access to and preservation and safekeeping of all this data call for greater security measures, which often means for more copies in more places. As images recording the present become preserved, they become past. Meanwhile, what's past becomes archived and opened to the present. Film reels, old photographs, and other productions are added to the archive of what's digitally viewable, storable, shareable, and remixable. Technologies of retrieval, from digitization software and sampling technologies to historical, archaeological, detective, and forensics tools of various kinds, enable an ever deeper digging into and unlocking of the past, the datability of the past, of the Earth as fossil, as echo, as geological stratum, adds to the archive of images, sounds, signs, and documents that can be dredged up and set into motion. With image and sound technologies, the past is now divisible into the era of reproducible images and the era that preceded it, BP, or before the photograph, and AP, Anno Fotografico, the year of our Lord photograph. One day we may count backwards to the year 1825, which will be the new year 0, when the first permanent photograph was produced in Chalon-sur-Saône, France. Sound technologies came later, and touch and smell technologies are still presumably in their infancy. Interactive media, from Google Glass to multi-user video games to increasingly lifelike virtual worlds, render data space more immersive, embodied, and fluid. Even if many of the pieces of liveliness found on YouTube and Vimeo are moments from the real world, found objects in a discoverable reality, the default mode of cinematic media is no longer the mimetic recording of reality, the capturing of reflected light onto film and the projection of it on two-dimensional rectangular screens in front of large audiences. Lev Manovich argues that cinema has again become a form of animation, the graphic manipulation of images. The growing archive of images and sounds becomes a database available for manipulation. Then there is the storage of all that. Every piece of data is material, but every object that stores, reads, produces, reproduces, manages, recombines, and even deletes data is also material. These entities are premised on an infrastructure by which materials like copper, lead, silver, tin, chromium, barium, silicon, mercury, beryllium, arsenic, and a variety of petrochemicals and otherwise hazardous compounds are mined, smelted, refined, manufactured, transported, and disposed by oil rig, airplane, land and sea cable, human hand and lung, and so on, with handling and exposure extended all along the way. E-waste has been the fastest growing waste stream for several years now. Digital storage capacity overtook analog storage capacity in 2002, and within 5 years, 94% of storage was digital. Humanity today stores some 300 exabytes of information. That's 300 followed by 18 zeros. But data disks degrade and must be replaced, and new formats require format conversion and migration, which means new storage replacing old storage, and old formats not going away but remaining as waste. Which brings us to the cloud. Cloud computing is the frontier of the personal computing industry, and in a sense marks the end of it. The end of the personal and the triumph of the nodal. In theory, cloud computing replaces local storage and software with storage and management of files on distant data centers or server farms. In practice, it supplements the former with the latter as a means of adding security to data files, which instead of being saved in one place, may be saved in several places to ensure ready access by multiple devices. Cloud computing contributes to the perception that digital media dematerialize our relations with the earth. But any image or data requires materiality for its existence, which most often means the materiality of coal-fired energy that feeds most data centers around the world still. Debates over the sustainability of the cloud revolve around the possibility of shifting from fossil fuels to renewable energy and toward a smart grid-style accounting of data use. And even as data storage moves to the cloud, 15% of global residential energy is spent on powering domestic digital technologies. Smart grid accounting of the cloud would limit its rematerialization to the arithmetical and statistical. Inherent in the expanding data archive is a slipperiness where objects cannot be pinned down. They're not exactly here where I'm accessing them, nor there on a server in Wyoming, Illinois, or Australia. They're in between, mobile, in the rush of semiosis. As the archive of images and sounds grows and dematerializes, or rather, as it is globalized into a cloud that's fuzzy in its spatial parameters but thoroughly material, boundaries distinguishing the personal and from the public are deterritorialized into databanks and flows, access to and power or control over which is the prize among competing players. In this digital gold rush, a de- and re-territorialization of global scale, the struggle to reestablish a democratic commons, a space that is open to all, but also responsive and responsible to all, takes on new forms. The common, as redefined by Negri, Hart, Casarino, and others, is a space of creative production that resists private possession. Ultimately, such struggle to recommonize, to render democratically accessible, is part and parcel of every deterritorialization the planet has seen. Which brings us to cinema. How does cinema, which I define as the art of the moving image, bear witness to this history? It's been argued that the rise of digital cinema has been accompanied by a shift to what Francesco Cassetti calls the slippery morphing image, and various theorists have begun to map out some of the ways in which the slippery morphing image reflects and heralds the changing geopolitical condition, variously referred to as global, neoliberal, postmodern, transnational, biopolitical, flexible, digital, networked, cognitive, neuro, fast, soft, smooth, and hyper-capitalism, as well as the opportunities for resistance to that condition. Stephen Shabiro describes this as a world of modulation, digitization, financialization, and media transduction, in which we've shifted from disciplinary forms of governmentality to a flexible, ever-accelerating society of ongoing, never-resting, and never-sated modulation that calls for continuous recombination for sheer survival. A description that closely parallels the description of digital media as a new form of animation offered by Manovich and others. These readings raise the question of what the precise relationship is between the slippery morphing image and hypercapitalism, and between image and political economy more generally. How determined is the image by the system of production within which it arises? Is slippery morphing imagery just a product of slippery morphing capitalism? Or might it be one of its tools, one of its tentacles, lures, and agents? Or is the relationship more complex and ambiguous? Might both be products of larger processes of acceleration and change that might be better tracked by terms such as the Anthropocene, the Homogenocene, the Capitalocene, the Cthulhucene, or others. To begin to answer this question, let's put it into an ecological context that sees all life on the planet as the product of one or another permutation of the interaction of energy, light and heat, originating from the sun with the surface of the earth that it strikes. Everything we know is an evolved permutation of that endlessly differentiating process. Let's call that process the morphogenocene. It includes everything, so the suffix "scene," which means new or new era, is only appropriate if we consider that novelty and change are built right into the system from the outset. Cinema, as we know it, is a product of a more specific political ecology. It arose alongside the industrialization of material production, an unleashing of productive capacities that had been stored on or beneath the surface of this planet for millennia. Let's call that the hydrocarbon era, or the petromorphogenocene, since it's specifically the transformation of petrochemicals that has powered the dramatic upsurge of morphogenesis, change and development, in this era. Or the petrognaceous, the era of burning petrochemicals, except that these terms focus on the burning itself and not on what gave rise to it, which is the process by which previously unknown and invisible entities, coal-bearing and other deposits lying deep beneath the ground, were turned into fuel that could be burned and consumed, which is another word for capital. The transformation into capital, followed by its consumption, suggests the era should simply be called the Capitalocene, which is exactly what environmental historian Jason W. Moore has been arguing in a series of papers. In contrast to the Anthropocene, which suggests that the anthropos is a unified planetary force that is singularly responsible for these effects, Capitalocene acknowledges that the transformation of the world into capital by some humans, arranged in certain kinds of collective relations with machines, combustive agents, relations forged over 500 years between ship and wind, crown and capital, metal and fuel, image and spectacle, have been very complex. Cinema, as Nadia Bozak delineates in The Cinematic Footprint, and which other eco-materialists have been arguing, is and has always been both part and parcel of such processes and thoroughly ecological. It has always depended on a powerful combination of two forms of solar energy, the capture of reflected solar light itself and the indirect products of that energy stored and compounded over millennia as fossil fuels. We might, following Henri Bergson, say that cinema is a form of captured, organized, and released light, heat, energy movement. In this, it takes what is common to all of us, all living substances, and reorganizes it in the crafting of meaningful worlds. To make cinema is to craft worlds from worlds, and in doing so, to bear an obligation to the light, heat, and energy used in their making. The digitalization of cinema is not a matter of post-industrialization, and certainly not post-capitalism, but simply the digital post-Fordist globalization of that same industrial capitalist world ecology. There are films that direct their gaze, at least in passing, at some of the permutations of this relationship between energy, light, heat, and the surface of the earth and/or of the film. They include the celebratory light experiments of avant-gardists like Stan Dawkins, reflexive documentary meditations on time, space, energy, and light, such as Peter Mettler's Picture of Light and his The End of Time, Werner Herzog's Wild Blue Yonder and Lessons of Darkness, Barrison and Ross's The Easter, the found footage and secondhand films of Craig Baldwin, Agnes Varda, and others, maybe even epic narratives like Terrence Malick's The Tree of Life or Lars von Trier's Melancholia that juxtapose the evolution of life itself or the demise of life with the micro-narratives of everyday life. Then there are the films that explicitly document the global political ecologies of extraction, production, consumption, and disposal. Films about the global ecology of waste make visible what's at the two ends of the industrial chains that have built the Capitalocene. Jennifer Beichwall's Manufactured Landscapes renders visible the dependency of the image maker, here it's landscape photographer Ed Bertinsky, on the landscapes of production and consumption he highlights in his large format industrial landscape shots. By extension, they do the same with the filmmaker, Beichwall, whose task is in part to contextualize Bertinsky's work within time, space, and social relations. Candida Brady's Trashed, Lucy Walker's Wasteland, about artist Vic Muniz's project of reclaiming for art the waste and the pickers of waste in one of the world's largest waste dumps outside Rio de Janeiro. Chris Jordan's photo exhibit and forthcoming film, Midway. These are all documents of the terminal end of the production cycle in its material and social aspects, including those humans and non-humans who scrape out a living amidst the toxic debris the rest of us leave behind. Films like Crude, Gasland, Petropolis, Big Men, Brenda Longfellow's interactive documentary Offshore, and David Dufresne's Fort McMoney, and a range of post-disaster films, from Trouble the Water to Beast of the Southern Wild to historical fictions like There Will Be Blood and future fictions, all document a range of relations between fossil fuel industrialism, toxicity, and the deteriorating conditions for human life in our time. Alan Sekula's and Noel Birch's The Forgotten Space brings the realities of global capitalism and its vehicles, in this case containerization, into focus in ways that are otherwise difficult to visualize. But some things resist visualization. The evidence of climate change is largely statistical. Toxins are typically invisible and inaudible. They rely on expert accounts for their very knowability. The effects of today's technologies, such as those of so-called unconventional or extreme oil and gas extraction, are unknowable in profoundly troubling ways. Their costs, as Alan Stokel argues, are not only hidden, they're unknowable in their hiddenness. The effects of the contamination of water, air, and land, and of climatic changes are unknown on scales that transcend what human political and economic systems are capable of conceiving. Maybe, Stokel writes, the arsenic or another of the chemicals used in hydraulic fracturing will move. Maybe this movement will happen over centuries or over thousands of years. Maybe it will be monitored for millennia, but more likely not, and so on. To deal with this unrepresentability of the ecological crisis, eco-documentaries, as well as their fictionalized analogs, which from an eco-materialist perspective are barely distinguishable categories, are at their best when they depict multiple temporalities and spatial scales, from the microscopic to the local to the transnational, and when they mix or juxtapose different narrative and vocal registers, explanatory, investigative, activist, testimonial, melodramatic, tragic, comic, ironic, lyrical, contemplative, self-reflexive, apocalyptic, fantastic, and phantasmic, creating complex polyphonic texts that reflect on their own making and appeal to the affective instincts that underpin burgeoning socio-ecological awareness. For a cinema that's not only attempting to address material dimensions of human ecological relations, but also to reflect on its own nature as cinema, as captured, organized, and released light, heat, energy movement, the challenge is to engage with the materialities, the socialities, and the perceptualities of the medium itself. This means, on some level, engaging with green cinema techniques such as the minimization of a film's or video's carbon footprint, But assessment of that sort of goal is notoriously unreliable, and it's only one piece of the movement toward a post-carbon cinema. Three questions have to be asked in tandem. The first of these has been the dominant focus of film criticism, that of representation. What does this image stand for, to whom, and at whose expense? But the other two are just as pressing, if not more so. There's the material question. What makes this image? With and from what or whom, and at what cost? And there is the effective, affective, and experiential question. What does this image do? With and for whom, and to what? These are, incidentally, the questions I ask in my book, which is called Ecologies of the Moving Image. In all of these, the whom is not always only human, and the what is not always only unhuman. We're dealing with subjects and objects in the making, such that the making, the doing, the affecting, and the standing for are always in motion. Digital media arts include promising experiments across a range of new strategies as well. Tactical media, interactive cinema, locative media, biomimetic technologies, and other new media forms can contribute to multi-directional engagements with places, spaces, 2 minutes, getting there, organisms and ecologies, such as the development of so-called sentient cities or sentient spaces, not for the purpose of surveillance and the promotion of new governmentalities, but for the purpose of expressing the multitude of narratives and social, sensory, and ecological engagements that exist so as to heighten sensitivity to our own emplaced agency within those relational engagements. Works like Fort McMoney, which I mentioned, and Offshore combine digital video archives with interactive elements, including video game simulations and forking paths, multiple narratives. In the case of David Dufresne's Fort McMoney. I'm going to skip over a little bit. I wanted to talk about a little bit about YouTube and the expanding database of uploaded materials, found objects that just make it into a kind of ever-expanding world of cinematic media, most of which is not feature-length films, but rather snippets that people feel with, we feel the world with. And this you probably recognize, the undersea spill cam from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. I won't say anything about the previous video for the sake of time. And of course all the videos that people upload, which provide kind of insight into some of the relations between people and non-humans that give us a sense of our own implication in various kinds of relationalities. There are just hundreds, probably thousands of videos of weird animal encounters, trans-species animal encounters, starling murmurations, and all kinds of other sorts of things. Okay, so to come to my conclusion. Cinema in a digital age presents a universe whose outer circumference is always expanding. Within that circumference, the dots that connect it together are not singular bounded units so much as they're fluid bursts, rather like bacteria that share genetic information across boundaries. The shape of the film viewing experience is being altered beyond recognition, so that now we have access to various bits of moving image material that is out there, that is being uploaded, that is being downloaded, that is being produced by us. Kristen Daly calls this Cinema 3.0, the interactive image, a world of imagery in which we participate. To understand how cinema might make its way into a post-carbon, post-Capitalism world, we should remember that cinematic communication is communication. And communication is not anything peculiar to humans. We live in a communicative universe, a universe of relations always in process, a universe that's brimming with the making of meaning, in which digital cinema makes the moving image corpuscular, microbial, microbiosemiotic. Moving images remind us that the world is animacy all the way down, and they could do that better. An ethical image in this context is one that witnesses its own making with others, such that its doing is ethically imbued in relation to others, and such that its doing is also an undoing, a recognition of process in its multiple embodiments, interdependent embedments, entanglements, and realignments. Earlier this week, associates of the Breakthrough Institute produced something called an eco-modernist manifesto, which proposes that we move full speed ahead with developing the technologies that would solve the massive problems, climate change among them, that they wholeheartedly acknowledge, unlike the denialists of every stripe, with whom they share their humanistic optimism. Between this Promethean hope of the eco-modernists and the resignation of the eco-fatalists, for whom nature is a darkly beautiful machine that will overrun us in the end, whether in 50, 500, or 5 million years, there ought to be a space for contemplating both the continued creative flourishing of life, including human life, and the end and death of life as we know it. What should be added to that duality in our imagination is the capacity to conceive of the end and death of carbon capitalism, the alcoholic and abusive father of the dysfunctional family alluded to yesterday by Jan Gunnar. What we need are affectively effective images that move us towards sensing the scope and scale of petrochemical civilization's episode on this earth, and at the same time towards sensing our own capacity to look that civilization in the eye, to stare it down, and to convince it that its time is ending, that a new world is being born, that none of us know what that world will look like, and that we, a we that does not yet exist, a hybrid collectivity in the process of dreaming itself up, are capable of building that world together. I'll end it there. Thank you.